Welcome to session 6 of our New Testament survey course. My name is Stephen Clybourne, and I am the senior pastor of Earl Street Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina. Every 6 years I teach through the Bible, and today we are in process of looking at the Gospel of Matthew. If you would like to follow along with us, you can find our study guide at our website, which is esbcgreenville.org. If you get to that website and click on the resources tab and then the Bible survey class, you can find the previous videos and study guide from the Old Testament and the previous videos and study guide for the New Testament. We are in the New Testament, and we will be picking up today on page 16 of that study guide as we continue to look at the Gospel of Matthew. In our last session, we talked about Matthew's Gospel in general, kind of introduced the Gospel in terms of authorship and date and historical setting. We talked some about Matthew's unique features. And we ended up last time talking about the purposes of Matthew's Gospel. Well, today we move on to talk about the structure of Matthew's Gospel. And you might remember, as we talked about the unique features of Matthew's Gospel, that one of the unique features was Matthew is the most Jewish of all 4 of the Gospels. And Matthew is clearly telling the story of Jesus in such a way as to show that Jesus is the fulfillment of Judaism. And that though Jesus came in continuity with Judaism, Jesus came also in discontinuity with Judaism. That Jesus actually broke the mold of what they expected the Messiah to be. Well, not only is the substance and content of Matthew's Gospel Jewish, but even the way Matthew's Gospel is structured is Jewish. I think it's the most structured of all 4 of the Gospels. It reflects the structure itself now is what I'm not talking about, the substance or content, but just the way the Gospel is structured. It reflects a Jewish mindset. So if you start to look at how Matthew's Gospel is organized and structured, you realize that there are 7 divisions of Matthew's Gospel. And that number is no accident. In Judaism, the number 7 symbolizes completion and perfection. So it is not surprising at all that when Matthew tells the story of Jesus, he organizes his story in 7 sections. And then the mid sections of those 7 sections are the 5 sections that comprise the main body of the gospel. And of course, 5 is also a number of significance in Judaism. 5 is the number of books in the Torah, the law of Moses. We have to be careful in assigning that connection to Matthew's intention, but it does seem more than coincidental that there are those 5 sections. So just as the Old Testament law was built around the discourses of Moses, each section of Matthew's Gospel is built around a long discourse of Jesus, whom Matthew presents as the new Moses. If you remember from our discussion last time, when Jesus's first public act of ministry is the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel, and Matthew says that Jesus went up on a mountain, reminiscent of when Moses went up on the mountain to receive and then deliver the will and word of God. Well, each of the 5 sections of Matthew's Gospel is built around a long discourse from Jesus. Each section is connected to the next section with this seam, as it is called. New Testament scholars refer to this as the Mathian Scene. This is how Matthew ties one section of his gospel to the next section. And this is how you know you have reached the end of one section and the beginning of another, because Matthew will have this phrase in at the end and beginning of the section, and when Jesus had finished. So you'll see that we'll notice this as we move along, that that's the way Matthew stitches together the 5 sections of his gospel. So in Matthew's gospel, Jesus finishes. That word finish is important. That is, Jesus completes, Jesus perfects that which Moses only could begin to disclose. And the distinctive feature of the scene in Matthew 26:1 is the addition of the word all. And when Jesus had finished all these things, signifying that this is the last section. So then, having instructed his disciples by 5 long discourses, Jesus now then, after Jesus has finished all of these sayings, then he teaches them the meaning of discipleship, not by his lessons, but by his life through his suffering and death. And we'll see that when we get to the final section. So Matthew draws an intimate connection between Jesus's teaching ministry and his passion, that is, his suffering and death. Let's take a look at these sections, and we'll notice a few distinctives of each section. The first section is in Matthew 3, beginning with verse 1 and going through Matthew 7, verse 29. And of course, the long discourse in this section is what we call the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. So notice how Matthew concludes the Sermon on the Mount, and this is how you know that he has reached the end of the first section and is beginning the second section. Picking up in chapter 7, verses 28 and 29, and when Jesus finished these sayings, there it is, the Mathian Scene, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority and not as their scribes. So the opening section in chapters 3 through 7 have as the long discourse in that section, the Sermon on the Mount. The next section is in chapters 8 through 10, the first verse of chapter 11. The first verse of chapter 11 says, and when Jesus had finished instructing his 12 disciples. That's how you know he's reached the end of the second section. In this section, we see Jesus teaching in Galilee. He heals a paralytic, and then beginning in chapter 10, he commissions and instructs the 12, and that is the long discourse in this section. As I said, that ends in chapter 11, verse 1. And then the third discourse picks up in 11:2 through 13:53. And the discourse, the long teaching section in that section is chapter 13. So in this section, beginning in chapter 11, the narratives illustrate the authority that Jesus claimed to have. In chapter 12, there is teaching about the Sabbath laws and how Jesus relates to the Sabbath laws. Later in chapter 12, there's the work of healing, and then further demonstrations of Jesus's power. the request for a sign, the return of the unclean spirit. Chapter 12 concludes by showing who Jesus's real family is. Jesus said, stretching out his hand toward his disciples, this is 12:49, stretching out his hand toward his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers, for whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." Jesus clearly is making reference to the fact that he is establishing a family of faith that supersedes even his own biological family. But then in chapter 13, we find the discourse. And in this case, the discourse is the teachings of his teachings in parables. There's the parable of the weed and the weeds and the wheat, the parable of the mustard seed, parable of the hidden treasure and the pearl of great value. And then you'll see in chapter 13, verse 53, that Mathian Scene. And when Jesus had finished these parables, he went away from there, signaling the beginning of the fourth section, which is 1354 through 19:1. In 1354, we start to see, and going really through chapter 17, we start to see the decisive acceptance of Jesus and the decisive rejection of Jesus. We see the death of John the baptizer, the feeding of the 5,000. We see Jesus walking on the water in chapter 14. In chapter 15, a discussion of the tradition of the elders. And later in chapter 15, the story of the Canaanite woman and other healings. Then later in chapter 15, 32 through 39, the feeding of the 4,000. And in chapter 16, the demand for signs, the leaven of the Pharisees, Peter's confession at Caesarea Philippi, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And it was here in Matthew's gospel that Jesus went on to commend Peter, saying, you are Simon Bar-Jonah, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. You are Petros, and on this Petra, the Greek words there play on the Greek word, I will build my church. And there's that word church. You remember from last time that Matthew is the only one of the four gospels who even uses the word church. Jesus said, "I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give to you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." He says this to Peter. And of course, that is the passage, really the formative passage that Roman Catholics use to show that Peter was the first pope, that Jesus had given to him the keys of the kingdom. After that, the sayings about the sayings about discipleship, and then the story of the transfiguration that appears in all three of the synoptic gospels, prophecies about Elijah, the epileptic child who was healed in chapter 17, verses 14 through 21. Again, the passion predictions where Jesus foretells his own suffering and death. The money for the temple tax and so on. But all of these are just reporting of events, but not a long section of teaching. But you get to the long sayings of section of teaching in chapter 18, sayings on humility and forgiveness, warnings about hell, the lost sheep, discipline among the followers, forgiveness is beyond calculating. And so the teaching takes place, the long discourse in this section takes place in chapter 18. And then you will notice that section ends in chapter 19:1 with the Mathian Scene. Now, when Jesus had finished these sayings, he went away from Galilee, which signals the beginning of the last section, 19:2 through 26:1. Here we find teachings about marriage and divorce in the early verses of chapter 19, the blessing of the children in verses 13 through 15 of chapter 19, the story of the rich young man in chapter 19, 16 through 30, the story of the laborers in the vineyard in chapter 20, verses 1 through 16, the passion, the sufferings, and death of Jesus predicted for a third time in chapter 20, verses 17 through 19. Then we see in chapter 20, verses 20 through 28, James and John seeking places of honor in the kingdom. In chapter 20, verses 29 through 34, the two men of Jericho. And then starting with chapter 21, we see what we would call Holy Week, or the last week, or the week of Jesus's Passion Week, which begins with an account of Palm Sunday in chapter 21, and then continues as Jesus cleanses the temple, curses the fig tree, claims to have authority. He gives the parable of the vineyard. He talks about the marriage feast, paying of taxes to Caesar. He answers the question about the resurrection. He gives the great commandment to love the Lord your God, and the second great commandment to love your neighbors yourself. In chapter 23, this long section about where Jesus talks about woe to the scribes and Pharisees. And this section of woes begins the long discourse, the final discourse in Matthew's gospel, the final discourse in that fifth section, which takes place in chapters 23 and 24. And then that section, the long discourse ends, and then Jesus gives his parables of the teachings of the coming kingdom, the parable of the talents, the parable of the sheep and the goats at the great judgment. And then that section ends with the Mathian Scene, the last Mathian Scene, in chapter 26, verse 1. And notice the addition of the word all. Now, you can tell that that this is the final scene, because this time Matthew says, and when Jesus had finished all these sayings. You can tell that Matthew is wrapping it up. This is his final scene, so to speak. Well, those are the 5 major sections. And then those 5 sections are bookended by a prologue or introduction and an epilogue or a conclusion. The prologue takes place, of course, at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 23. This is the genealogy that Matthew gives us. We talked about last time, the birth stories of the wise men and the flight to Egypt. And then the epilogue takes place in chapter 26 through chapter 28, which talks about the death of Jesus, it talks about the Last Supper, the prayer in Garden of Gethsemane, and Jesus's trial before Caiaphas and then before Pilate, the crucifixion itself, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus, and then Matthew's gospel concludes with what we would now call the Great Commission. I don't think I forgot to advance these slides. The Great Commission, which takes place in chapter 28, verses 16 through 20. So you can see how the structure of Matthew's gospel serves his overall purpose, and that is to tell the story of Jesus in a way that the Jews would respond to it and relate to it and identify with it. Well, there are some themes that emerge in Matthew's gospel. The first theme is Jesus as the Messiah, the Christ, the Anointed One, the Son of God. As I mentioned last time, Matthew achieves a more exalted Christology, that is, has a loftier view of Christ than Mark, because he dismantles Mark's so-called messianic secret. In Mark's gospel, there is this kind of ongoing question about who Jesus is. But as early as the genealogy and infancy narrative in Matthew's gospel, Matthew establishes Jesus's identity and messianic pedigree. Matthew wants us to know from the very beginning who Jesus is, and not just who Jesus is, but Jesus's connection with and continuity with Judaism, to show that Jesus has his messianic lineage. The virgin birth, the birth in Bethlehem, the flight to Egypt, the hometown of Nazareth, all of these are cited by Matthew as fulfillments of Old Testament prophecies. And in Matthew's gospel, the Gentiles are actually the first to recognize Jesus. These pagan astrologers or wise men from the east who made the long journey following the star, they are the first ones to really acknowledge who Jesus is. Matthew's Sermon on the Mount presents Jesus as the authoritative teacher who brings the Mosaic law to its fulfillment. At the very outset, after the introductory materials in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said in chapter 5, verse 17, "Don't think I've come to destroy the law and the prophets. I have not come to destroy what Moses has said. I have come to fulfill what Moses has said." The 10 mighty works or miracles which follow the Sermon on the Mount show that Jesus is not just powerful in word, but also in deed, which is what gives him such authority. His words and deeds sync up. And by the time of Jesus's passion, Matthew has supplied the reader with a much more exalted view of Jesus's identity, so that by the time Jesus dies, the reader realizes, the reader grasps and understands that the one who died was the Messiah. The one who died was the Messianic King. The one who died was the very Son of God. And not only did he die, but he was buried and he was raised. And of course, as I mentioned, the gospel concludes with Jesus's commission to his disciples to make disciples of all nations. Disciples make disciples who make disciples. The second theme I notice in Matthew's gospel is not just who Jesus is, but the rejection of who Jesus is. The rejection of Jesus precisely as the Messiah, that that the people who reject him do not see him for who he claims to be and who Matthew presents him to be. So the drama of Matthew's gospel consists in this refusal by Israel to accept Jesus as the Messiah. And this is really a theme that is carried throughout Matthew's gospel. This is why Jesus reserved some of his harshest words of all in chapter 23 for the Pharisees, who were the religious leaders of Judaism. The theme of rejection is especially prominent in 3 sections. First, in the infancy narrative, conspicuously absent from the infancy narratives are the chief priests, the scribes, the elders, and the Pharisees. I mean, when Jesus is born, his birth is not attended by the Jewish dignitaries. Instead, as early as the infancy stories, there's a hint that the Gentiles will receive and welcome the Jewish Messiah, even though the Jews will not. The ultimate irony that even though Jesus is the fulfillment of all the Jewish hopes and prophecies, the Jews are the very ones who reject him, and the Gentiles from as early as his infancy are the ones who receive him and worship him. Also, you see the rejection of Jesus the Messiah in his Galilean ministry. When Jesus is ministering in Galilee in chapters 11 through 13, the turning point in Matthew's gospel is chapter 11, when the first major opposition to Jesus is expressed. And this rejection spreads until Jesus is rejected in his own hometown of Nazareth. This section is framed by two references to people being offended, literally scandalized by Jesus. In chapter 11, verse 6, you see these words. And blessed is he who takes no offense at me. Blessed is he who is not scandalized by me. And then in chapter 13, verse 57, and they took offense at him. And Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house. So during his Galilean ministry, the very people who should have received him and recognized him rejected him. And a third place where you see the rejection of Jesus the Messiah is when Jesus gets to Jerusalem, beginning on Holy Week, on Palm Sunday. The three parables in that section, the parable of the two sons, the parable of the vineyard, and the parable of the marriage feast, might be interpreted as the Messiah's rejection of Israel and Israel's rejection of the Messiah. It seems like at this point, Jesus is not only acknowledging that the Jews are rejecting him, but because of their rejection of him, Jesus rejects them. And then in chapter 23, as I've already mentioned a couple of times in this session, Jesus issues this stinging denunciation of the Pharisees, claiming that they killed the prophets in the past, and now they were rejecting the very Messiah they say they long for. A third theme I see in Matthew's gospel is the theme of the church as being the replacement of Israel. That what Israel was in the Old Testament, the church is in the New Testament. That the people of God in the Old Testament was the nation Israel. The people of God in the New Testament were the disciples who make up the church. Israel's rejection of the Messiah and the Messiah's rejection of Israel result then in the transferal of the kingdom of God to another people, the church. In the Passion narrative, in the chapters describing Jesus' suffering and death in Matthew's gospel, this occurs at the very moment of Jesus' death. The apocalyptic events which surround his death, the tearing of the temple curtain and the resurrection of the dead, indicate that this is the beginning of a new age. This new kingdom is going to include the Gentiles, 4 non-Israelite women included in the genealogy, the wise men, Galilee of the Gentiles as Jesus's base of operations. All of these elements signal that God is forming a new people. There are two very revealing passages. One is in chapter 8, verses 8 through 12, in which Jesus kind of makes the transfer by saying that Abraham's real descendants receive their status as children of God, not necessarily by bloodline, but by faith. Abraham's real children are not just his biological descendants, but they are the ones who believe. And second, in the passage that I mentioned earlier, Jesus's own household ultimately has nothing to do with physical descent. He turns to his disciples and says, "This is my family." Clearly, a new family is being formed. And in Matthew's gospel, the family is identified as the church. The disciples form the core of the church, though they are drawn from Israel. And when the disciples fall in Matthew, it's not from their lack of understanding, as in Mark, it's from their lack of faith. The disciples understand in Matthew's gospel, their faith falters at the critical moment. Another theme I see in Matthew's gospel is that Jesus is the model of righteousness. Righteousness was a a term that was very rich with Old Testament theology. But having taught his disciples in word in these 5 long discourses by which Matthew's gospel is structured, then Jesus teaches them through his sacrificial death, through his suffering. Jesus's final teaching, then, the ultimate teaching, is the laying down of his life, the lesson without which the disciples cannot fully understand his identity. Jesus came to fulfill, that is, to fill full the law and the prophets, to do and to complete the law and the prophets. You see, the Pharisees practiced the law, but since they did not practice it as Jesus the Messiah interpreted it, they did not fulfill God's will. They were trying to obey the letter of the law, but did not understand its spirit. And that's what Jesus meant when he said that our righteousness must exceed that of the scribes and Pharisees. The scribes and Pharisees had a very legalistic notion of righteousness. But Jesus said your righteousness has to be more than just checking off boxes of laws. In fulfillment of his own teaching, Jesus was persecuted for righteousness' sake and thereby became the fulfillment of one of his own beatitudes that he presented in the Sermon on the Mount. Well, next week, we are going to look at Luke's portrait of Jesus in our next session. I do hope that you will let me know if you're watching this video. I sometimes toy around with the idea of saying something completely ridiculous in here just to see if anybody's listening. But every now and then I'll hear from one of you, but I would love to talk to you. You want to email me or call me or text me and just want to talk about any of this, if you're wondering about anything, or if you have some opinions about things or questions, I'd love to have that kind of conversation with you. So don't hesitate to get in touch with me. And I hope I'll get to see you in the next session as we look at what might be my favorite of all the Gospels, the Gospel of Luke. I hope to see you then.